In the chaotic twilight of World War II, as Allied forces advanced through war-torn Italy in 1944, a covert mission was underway. Elite units of the German SS, under direct orders from Heinrich Himmler, stormed through regions on the verge of liberation, not to secure military advantage, but to retrieve a book. Not just any book, but one that Himmler considered sacred. A manuscript he believed held the ideological key to legitimizing Nazi racial doctrine. In the midst of the destruction, these troops scoured libraries and private collections in search of a Roman text written nearly 2 millennia earlier. It was known as Germania, a treatise that Himmler and others in the SS believed contained irrefutable evidence of Aryan superiority. For them, this was not just literature, it was a foundation for genocide. The book, written by the Roman senator Tacitus in the 1st century AD, was revered by Nazi ideologues as a Bible of racial purity. According to their beliefs, it validated a mythological narrative that modern Germans were the direct descendants of a heroic, untainted warrior race that had once challenged the might of Rome itself. Tacitus's words were twisted into a scholarly justification for racial hierarchies and the marginalization and eventual extermination of those deemed inferior. Himmler would stop at nothing to possess what he viewed as the proof behind the Reich's most horrific policies. The obsession with Germania did not emerge out of nowhere. It took root in a fragile political landscape after Hitler rose to power in January 1933. Though now Chancellor, his grip on Germany was far from absolute. Support for the Nazis was split, and the country remained a patchwork of identities following its recent unification from independent states. Hitler and his inner circle sought a narrative powerful enough to bind the German people together. They found it in a myth, the belief that Germans were heirs to an ancient superior race known as the Aryans. According to Nazi mythology, the Aryans had once resided in Atlantis, the lost city described by Plato, and later migrated to the northern plains of Europe. These imagined forebears were described as tall, blonde, and intellectually unmatched, a race whose genius had spawned civilization itself. For the Nazis, Germania offered what they desperately lacked: historical validation. Tacitus, they believed, had recorded the existence of these noble ancestors, strong, virtuous, and uncorrupted by the decadence that plagued other ancient peoples. This mythical narrative became central to the Nazis' self-image and propaganda machine. The idea was not merely to unify a fractured Germany, but to convince its citizens that they were destined to dominate, based on bloodlines that supposedly stretched back to pre-Roman antiquity. By the way, if you enjoy stories like this, ones that uncover how distorted ideas shaped our world, consider subscribing to the channel. We're aiming to reach 1,000 subscribers by June 30th, and every single one helps us keep bringing you content like this. The myth of an Aryan golden age offered the Nazis a powerful ideological anchor, but there was a crucial flaw. It was entirely unproven. No archaeological discovery, no historical record definitively confirmed the existence of a superior Germanic civilization predating Rome. Yet, the Nazis pointed to Germania as the missing puzzle piece. Written around 98 AD by Cornelius Tacitus, a Roman senator and orator, the text described various tribes inhabiting northern Europe, people whom Tacitus claimed the mighty Roman Empire had failed to conquer. These tribes, referred to as the Germani, were characterized as fierce, noble, and deeply independent. In 9 AD, 3 Roman legions under General Varus were annihilated by a coalition of Germanic tribes led by Arminius, a moment seen by the Nazis as proof of ancestral greatness. For Hitler and Himmler, the defeat of Rome by supposed German ancestors was not just a historical event, it was symbolic validation of racial superiority. Tacitus's account transformed Arminius into a national hero, a prototype of the perfect Aryan warrior. The Nazi leadership clung to every passage of Germania that seemed to glorify these ancient tribes, overlooking or deliberately ignoring its contradictions and criticisms. They treated the book not as a nuanced historical observation, but as gospel that aligned perfectly with their vision of destiny and dominance. What made Germania particularly compelling to the Nazis was how Tacitus described the customs and character of the Germanic people in ways that conveniently mirrored Nazi ideals. He wrote of a society that valued strength, loyalty, simplicity, and moral uprightness. According to his account, these tribes had no tolerance for vice or corruption, chose their leaders based on merit, and held a near-sacred respect for purity, both moral and racial. He praised their monogamy, chastity, and disdain for material wealth, presenting a civilization seemingly immune to the decadence of Rome. To the Nazi propagandists, this was a treasure trove. Here was an ancient Roman-written validation of their belief that modern Germans descended from an unspoiled, honorable race. They selectively quoted Tacitus's admiration for their blue eyes, blonde hair, and imposing stature, elevating these descriptions into the physical standard for the ideal Aryan. Within this mythos, Germania was far more than a historical document. It was a spiritual and racial manifesto. For Himmler, it became a blueprint for reshaping German society. The SS was modeled after the noble warriors of the past, with its members trained to embrace the virtues outlined in Tacitus's writings. From the way they fought to the way they raised their children, everything was to mirror the imagined life of their heroic ancestors. Himmler's personal connection to Germania began long before he became one of the most feared men in the Third Reich. In 1924, still a relatively unknown figure, Himmler read Tacitus's manuscript during a train journey, and the experience marked him deeply. In his diary, he wrote of being captivated by the portrayal of the ancient Germanic tribes, their strength, discipline, and untainted nature. To Himmler, this was more than admiration. It was revelation. He saw in Tacitus's words a mirror of his own beliefs, as if the Roman historian had foreseen the ideals that Himmler wished to instill in modern Germany. This reading laid the groundwork for what would become an obsession. As he climbed the ranks of the Nazi regime, Himmler increasingly turned to Germania not just as inspiration, but as doctrine. He envisioned the SS not merely as a military force, but as a spiritual successor to the ancient warriors described by Tacitus. Rituals were introduced. Youth were trained to fight, to revere their bloodline, and to embody the virtues of loyalty and sacrifice. Even family policies were shaped by this obsession. Women who bore many children were awarded medals, echoing Tacitus's note that strength came from offspring. Every effort was made to revive a mythologized past and make it the model for the future. As Himmler's influence grew, so did his determination to mold the Nazi state in the image of the society he believed Tacitus had documented. The Germania was declared essential reading for all educated Germans, especially within the SS. Himmler encouraged citizens to study it, to internalize its values, and to see themselves as part of a noble lineage that stretched back to prehistory. Schools introduced lessons that mirrored the tribal customs mentioned in the book. Children pledged allegiance to their leaders, as ancient youths supposedly did to their war chiefs. Physical education emphasized combat readiness, and traditional games were replaced with weapon drills and mock battles. Naked sword dances and strength competitions became part of the SS training culture. Rituals directly inspired by Tacitus's writing, but the influence of Germania did not stop at symbolic imitation. It became the intellectual foundation for the Nazi regime's most sinister laws. In 1935, the Reich introduced the law for the protection of German blood and honor, which forbade marriages between Jews and non-Jewish Germans. The justification: a single line from Tacitus that claimed the ancient Germans did not mix with other peoples. That phrase became the academic scaffolding for policies that would escalate into ethnic cleansing and genocide. In this way, Germania transitioned from a Roman ethnography into a weaponized tool of racial doctrine. The elevation of Germania to sacred status within Nazi ideology meant that having access to an original copy became a matter of obsession for Himmler. He was not content with relying on reproductions or second-hand interpretations. He craved the original manuscript, a physical relic he believed would complete the ideological foundation of the SS and the Reich itself. But this was no easy feat. The original manuscript of Tacitus had been lost centuries ago, likely destroyed or misplaced in the upheavals following the fall of the Roman Empire. Still, rumors persisted that a highly accurate medieval copy of Germania, known as the Codex Asinus, had survived. This version, supposedly transcribed by an Italian scholar in the 15th century, was said to be housed somewhere in Italy, locked away in a private collection. For Himmler, the Codex represented more than historical interest. It was a relic of Aryan heritage, a link to a fabricated past he desperately wanted to make real. In 1935, he instructed one of the SS's most unusual branches, the Ahnenerbe, to begin searching for the Codex. Unlike the armed divisions of the SS, the Ahnenerbe consisted of scholars, historians, linguists, and pseudo-intellectuals. Their mission was to gather evidence of Aryan superiority, even if it meant distorting history or fabricating facts to support their theories. The Codex Asinus became one of their most coveted targets. The Ahnenerbe, officially founded under Himmler's direction, was one of the most peculiar and insidious arms of the Nazi regime. On paper, it appeared to be an academic institution dedicated to studying ancient Germanic history and heritage. In reality, it functioned as an ideological factory, one where selective readings, myth-making, and fabricated research were mass-produced to support the racial fantasies of the Nazi elite. The group's members were a mix of genuine scholars and eccentric ideologues, all united by a willingness to reinterpret history to suit Nazi goals. By 1936, their efforts had borne fruit. After extensive investigation, the Ahnenerbe traced the location of the Codex Asinus to the private library of Count Aurelio Baldeschi Baliani, an Italian aristocrat who owned several estates and was unaware of the manuscript's symbolic significance to the Nazis. The Codex had been gathering dust in one of his family libraries for centuries, largely forgotten among other antiquarian texts. When Mussolini was informed of its value to the Nazi cause, he saw an opportunity to please Hitler. Hoping to strengthen the Italo-German alliance, he arranged for the manuscript to be transferred as a diplomatic gift. However, the Count refused to cooperate. Disapproving of Mussolini's fascist regime, he declined to hand over the Codex, viewing the Nazis' interest as both invasive and absurd. His resistance set off a 2-year campaign of diplomatic pressure, personal visits, and veiled threats, all orchestrated to seize a manuscript that had become, in Himmler's mind, a holy artifact. Despite the Count's refusal, Himmler was not ready to abandon his pursuit. While diplomatic efforts failed, he began preparing for more direct action. By 1938, a compromise was reached. Though the Nazis would not receive the Codex itself, they were granted permission to photograph it. The manuscript was sent under guard to Rome, where a member of the Ahnenerbe, Rolf Hilscher, was permitted to create a complete photographic reproduction. These high-resolution images were rushed back to Germany, where they were used to publish a new official Nazi edition of Germania. Himmler personally wrote the preface, glorifying the text as a guide for the future of the Reich and declaring that only those who understood their ancestry could lead Germany forward. Though he still yearned for the original, this facsimile was presented to the public with great fanfare. Panels featuring quotes from Tacitus were displayed at party rallies, and Germania was increasingly portrayed as sacred scripture rather than classical literature. Himmler's attempt to transform myth into political reality had taken a new step forward. But the Count's refusal still rankled, and the fact that the manuscript remained out of reach gnawed at Himmler's obsession. It wasn't just about validation anymore. It had become personal. He viewed the possession of the Codex as a final, symbolic triumph over history itself. As the war crept closer, the lines between propaganda and madness blurred further, and so did Himmler's resolve to claim the artifact, no matter the cost. When World War II erupted in 1939, the alliance between Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy provided a renewed opportunity. As Hitler and Mussolini deepened their military cooperation, Himmler believed that the Codex Asinus could now be seized by force if diplomacy continued to fail. His obsession, once limited to ideological circles, began to affect military decisions. In 1943, following Mussolini's downfall and Italy's defection to the Allied side, German forces occupied large parts of the country to stabilize the southern front. Under the guise of strategic deployment, Himmler dispatched an SS unit with a secret mission: to retrieve the Codex from the Count's estate. The Baliani family owned multiple properties, and the book could be hidden in any one of them. SS troops raided the Count's countryside villa near Jesi but found it abandoned. The family had anticipated danger and relocated both themselves and their most valuable possessions. However, one critical clue emerged. Servants had moved crates of valuables, possibly including the Codex, to one of the Count's other homes, the town palace in Jesi. Disguised among hay and produce on farm carts, the manuscript might have been smuggled right past Himmler's men. Undeterred, the SS stormed the palace next. They demanded the book and interrogated staff aggressively, but once again found nothing. Either the manuscript was extraordinarily well hidden, or it had been moved again just ahead of their arrival. If you've made it this far, chances are the story has grabbed your attention as much as it did ours while researching it. So why not give the video a like? It really helps more people discover this kind of content. And hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next historical deep dive. With their searches at the villa and town palace yielding no results, Himmler's men turned their attention to the final Baliani property, a secluded palazzo located in the town of Ostra Vetera, about 30 kilometers away. The Count and his family had taken refuge there, believing it to be safer from Nazi reach. Yet the SS had grown increasingly desperate. Himmler, who had invested years of obsession and state resources in obtaining the Codex, now pushed for results with growing impatience. The troops arrived at the palazzo and began a methodical search. The house was locked and appeared quiet, but the fear inside was palpable. The Baliani children, including a young daughter and her brothers, watched from the windows in terror as soldiers approached. Their parents hurried them into the cellar, where the family would remain hidden for over 2 weeks. The SS conducted an extensive search of the residence, unaware of the concealed door that led to the basement. Though armed and aggressive, the soldiers never discovered the hidden passage. Inside the cellar, the Balianis waited in silence, rationing food, enduring the cold, and living under the constant threat of discovery. For 18 days, the family lived in fear, never knowing if the next knock would mean arrest or death. Yet, despite the intensity of the search, the Codex remained hidden, and the Balianis, along with the manuscript, survived undetected. The war in Europe came to a close on May 8, 1945. Nazi Germany collapsed under the weight of its own horrors, and its leadership either fled, was captured, or died by suicide. Hitler ended his life in a Berlin bunker. Himmler, after being taken into British custody, swallowed poison to escape trial. With their downfall, the Nazi dream of reviving a mythical Germanic past died as well. Yet questions about the Codex Aesinas remained. Where had it been all along? How had it avoided capture despite the exhaustive Nazi efforts? In time, the truth emerged. The manuscript had never left the Baliani family's first villa in Jesi, the very place Himmler's troops had searched first. Hidden behind a false wall that mimicked a window, a cleverly disguised room lay undisturbed. The entrance was concealed behind a large wardrobe, and within it sat a modest chest used to store laundry. Inside that chest, wrapped in household linens, was the Codex Aesinas. It had never been smuggled out, never moved from estate to estate. It had been there all along, protected by clever design, courage, and the refusal of one family to yield to tyranny. After the war, the Italian government recognized the manuscript as a national treasure. For 2 decades, it remained proudly on display in the family's private library in Jesi, no longer a target of war, but a symbol of defiance. For years after the war, the Codex Aesinas remained under the guardianship of the Baliani family, preserved in their library and inspected annually by Italian cultural authorities. Each year, government officials would travel to Jesi to verify the book's condition and ensure it was still in the family's possession. Then, in 1966, a routine change altered everything. That year, inspectors asked the Count to bring the manuscript to Florence instead, as they were unable to travel to Jesi. Trusting in the city's infrastructure and safety, the Count complied. He placed the Codex in a bank vault in central Florence, where it would remain overnight before being presented to the officials the next morning. But fate intervened. On the night of November 4th, 1966, torrential rains caused the Arno River to overflow, resulting in the worst flood Florence had seen in centuries. Water rushed through the streets, sweeping away vehicles, artworks, and irreplaceable documents. The Codex, stored underground, was submerged in oil-stained floodwaters, along with countless other cultural treasures. When the vault was opened, the manuscript appeared ruined. Its first and last pages were nearly illegible, stained dark and warped by water and chemicals. To those who had protected it for generations, it seemed the precious book had been lost, not to war or theft, but to an accident of nature. For a time, it looked as though one of the last tangible links to ancient Germania had been erased forever. But the story of the Codex Aesinas did not end in that flooded vault. Experts in manuscript restoration, recognizing its historical significance, embarked on an arduous months-long effort to save it. Page by page, the fragile parchment was dried, cleaned, and repaired using the most advanced techniques available. The damage was severe, but not irreversible. Eventually, the text became legible again, though some sections, particularly the beginning and end, remained permanently scarred. Despite this, the Codex was declared stable enough for preservation and academic study. By the early 1970s, the Baliani family, recognizing the book's importance beyond private ownership, made a monumental decision. They donated the manuscript to the Italian state. It was transferred to the Biblioteca Nazionale in Rome, where it would be protected and made accessible to scholars worldwide. With this act, the family ensured that the Codex would never again be hidden, hunted, or used as a political weapon. Instead, it would stand as a symbol of history reclaimed from distortion, a text whose words had once fueled hatred, now serving as a cautionary tale of the dangers of ideological manipulation. Tacitus's work, once co-opted to justify genocide, was now preserved not for propaganda, but for truth. In the hands of historians, the Codex Aesinas finally found its rightful place, not as a blueprint for supremacy, but as a relic of a complex, misinterpreted past. With the Codex Aesinas now in academic custody, scholars from around the world began re-evaluating its contents, this time through a lens grounded in historical context rather than racial ideology. What they discovered stood in stark contrast to the Nazi interpretation. While Tacitus did describe certain virtues of the Germanic tribes, such as bravery and loyalty, he also highlighted their flaws. He criticized their indulgence in alcohol, their frequent violent quarrels, and their deep-seated laziness. Tacitus wrote that these tribes often spent entire days feasting, that drunkenness was common, and that disputes were frequently resolved through bloodshed. He even described their penchant for gambling to the point of slavery, and mocked their aversion to peace, calling them idle when not engaged in war. This fuller reading dismantled the myth Himmler had spent years cultivating. Far from painting a portrait of noble savages, Tacitus portrayed the Germanic peoples as primitive, chaotic, and morally ambiguous. His descriptions, rather than validating a narrative of Aryan superiority, reflected the condescending perspective of a Roman aristocrat commenting on a society he considered barbaric. It became increasingly evident that the Nazis had cherry-picked and exaggerated isolated lines, deliberately ignoring the broader, more critical tone of the text. Their ideological weapon had been forged through manipulation, not scholarship. Worse still for the Nazi mythos was the realization that Tacitus had likely never seen the tribes he described. His entire account of the Germanic peoples was based on hearsay, second-hand reports, and Roman prejudice. Some passages drifted into outright fantasy, tales of tribes with monstrous features or mythical behaviors. By the end of the Germania, Tacitus even recounts legends of beings with human faces and animal bodies, clearly fictional additions that underline how speculative his entire work was. Modern historians concluded that the text was less an ethnography than a rhetorical device, a way for Tacitus to criticize Roman decadence by idealizing a simpler, supposedly purer society. In doing so, he created a mirror not of the tribes themselves, but of Rome's own anxieties. That the Nazis had built an ideological foundation upon such shaky ground revealed the extent to which they were willing to distort truth to serve their agenda. Even the notion that modern Germans were direct descendants of the tribes described in Germania fell apart under scrutiny. Ethnographers and geneticists alike demonstrated that today's German population descends from a mixture of countless groups that migrated through Europe over centuries. The simplistic equation of ancient Germany with modern Germans was not only wrong, it was intellectually dishonest. Himmler's dream of a pure lineage based on Tacitus's flawed narrative had been nothing more than an illusion built on selective memory and manipulated scholarship. As post-war Europe rebuilt itself, the tale of Himmler's pursuit of the Codex Essinus stood as a chilling reminder of how far a regime could go to fabricate legitimacy through distorted history. For Himmler, the book was never about scholarship. It was a mirror in which he hoped to see a purified vision of the German people, stripped of contradiction and imperfection. But history, unlike ideology, resists simplicity. Tacitus's Germania, when read in full and in context, reveals a nuanced and often critical portrayal of the tribes Himmler so admired. The text does not exalt racial superiority. It challenges the reader to examine virtue and vice across cultures. The tragedy lies in how this complexity was ignored, twisted into something dangerous by those seeking validation for inhuman policies. Himmler and his academic apparatus did not misread Tacitus by accident. They did so deliberately, selecting only what suited their vision and burying what contradicted it. Their efforts were part of a broader machinery of propaganda that weaponized knowledge, repurposing history as a tool of control. And while the original manuscript eluded their grasp, their manufactured version of it helped justify laws that dehumanized millions. From these distortions sprang policies that ultimately led to forced sterilizations, mass deportations, and industrialized murder. The danger of their project was not merely in the lies they told, but in the truth they buried beneath them. Today, the Codex Iasenas resides safely within the walls of the Biblioteca Nazionale in Rome, protected not just as a historical artifact, but as a symbol of the resilience of truth over tyranny. Its survival, through war, fascist, obsession, and natural disaster, stands in stark contrast to the fragile empire that once sought to claim it. Scholars continue to study its pages, not to forge myths, but to better understand how narratives evolve, how texts are interpreted, and how easily even the most ancient words can be corrupted by ideology. The story of Germania is no longer solely about what Tacitus wrote. It is about what others tried to make of it, and how dangerously seductive those distortions can become. The lessons left behind are as urgent now as ever. History must be read in full, not excerpted to serve agendas. Culture cannot be weaponized without consequence, and truth, though often hidden and vulnerable, can endure even the most violent attempts to suppress it. The Baliani family, by protecting the manuscript, did more than preserve a document. They preserved the integrity of history itself. Their quiet resistance reminds us that courage often looks like defiance in the face of power, and that the defense of knowledge is itself an act of heroism. The Germania remains, but its meaning now belongs to all, not to those who would twist it for hatred. The Nazi obsession with the Codex Iasenas was more than an academic curiosity. It was a case study in how myths are built, weaponized, and ultimately turned into instruments of oppression. At its heart, this obsession reveals the fragility of ideologies that must rewrite history to justify their existence. Himmler's determination to recover the manuscript was not fueled by a love of antiquity, but by a desperate need to anchor a radical worldview in something ancient, something perceived as immutable and pure. But the irony is inescapable. The very document they exalted undermined their beliefs. Tacitus never intended to glorify a people. He used them as a rhetorical foil to criticize Rome's excesses. And the ancient tribes he described were neither ancestors to modern Germans nor paragons of racial purity. In chasing a myth, the Nazis revealed their own insecurities. They required a past that never existed in order to validate a future they hoped to create. But truth has a way of surviving even the darkest efforts to conceal it. The Codex, hidden away by a principled family, preserved not only itself, but the ability for later generations to uncover the lies built around it. Through the lens of time, it is clear that the most powerful element of the Codex was not what it said, but what it revealed about those who tried to control it. The legacy of the Germania saga offers more than a cautionary tale. It offers hope. In a time when falsehoods were elevated and truth was endangered, individuals stood firm. The Baliani family risked their lives to protect a manuscript not because they shared its interpretations, but because they believed in its preservation as a cultural and historical treasure. They resisted not with weapons, but with silence, with strategy, with bravery, and in doing so, they preserved a piece of humanity's intellectual heritage from falling into the hands of those who would distort it beyond recognition. Their story reminds us that resilience is not always loud. Sometimes it hides in cellars, behind wardrobes, in dusty linen chests, waiting for the world to be ready for the truth again. The Codex Iasenas now lives on, not as a relic of supremacy, but as a monument to clarity, courage, and context. The horrors justified in its name cannot be undone, but the future can be better informed by understanding how easily ideas can be corrupted when placed in the wrong hands. To read Germania today is to engage not only with an ancient world, but with a modern warning. History must be handled with care, and truth, however fragile, is worth protecting. Because when truth survives, so too does the hope for a better, more honest world. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What struck you most about this story? Was it the scale of ideological manipulation, the bravery of the family who hid the manuscript, or the way truth managed to outlive propaganda? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Your feedback helps us understand what resonates with you and how we can improve future episodes.